Hey, welcome everybody. I'm Dave Price. We're joining you on a variety of websites this afternoon across the Gray Television family. And we appreciate all of you tuning in, whether you are doing it from within Iowa's borders or beyond. If you haven't heard, it's snowing and we're getting a lot of snow. So we're going to try something especially challenging as we go here. And Vivek Ramaswamy is literally joining us on the move from his campaign vehicle as he tries to navigate this challenging weather scenario that we have today. Hey, we appreciate it. We've been working with your team for a while to figure out logistics. I don't generally have to ask this during an interview, but I'm kind of hunkered down in Cedar Rapids right now. Where in Iowa are you?
We're in western Iowa, about maybe an hour or so, it says, from Council Bluffs.
Okay.
And so I'm excited to get there for our third event of the day. We started in the Northwest. We went to Fort Dodge. We had two events up there, and then we're now on our way from there to Council Bluffs. And we have a final event in Des Moines tonight where we'll be finishing the evening.
Well, we have a bunch of questions to try to get through, and to remind everybody for your patience through this, we have a candidate on the move here, and so we are kind of at the mercy of signal strength. So say your prayers, and we'll see if we can roll through this, and we can see and hear everybody throughout our discussion. But a lot of questions to get to. Okay, so to start off, obviously you're one of a half dozen folks in our state running in this caucus campaign. You've done more campaign events than anybody else by far, just to set this up. Clearly you're going among your competitors, Donald Trump, and so we have a series of questions about that, and I'll only do a few of them here. But Andy will just lead us off here, and he says simply, in what way specifically do you differ from President Trump, and how would your presidency differ from that of his? So how would you answer that?
Sure. So I think there's nobody else in this race, Donald Trump included, who's going to do a better job than me of shutting down the deep state, not reforming it, but actually shutting it down. I'm going to fire 75% of federal bureaucrats. I'm going to shut down agencies that should not exist, from the FBI to the ATF to the CDC to the U.S. Department of Education. We're going to get in there and actually shut them down. That's how we revive this constitutional republic. And so in many ways, when it comes to policy, I'm going further in the direction of draining the swamp and gutting the deep state that Donald Trump did. I'm also going further with respect to ending illegal mass migration in this country. I'm not just going to build the wall. I'm going to use our own military to secure the southern border. I'm ending birthright citizenship for the kids of illegals. And anybody who's in this country illegally will be returned to their country of origin. So on policy, I'm 90% aligned with him, but I would say that I'm going further with our America First agenda. I respect him as a president. I think he was a great president. But I think we deserve now the next phase of the America First movement. The reality, though, it's not just policy that differentiates a president. I think it's going to take somebody with fresh legs who can reach and lead the next generation of Americans, revive national pride amongst young Americans who are lost, I would say completely rudderless when it comes to purpose and meaning and identity. And I don't think that a Republican Party that just criticizes the other side is inspiring that next generation enough. To the contrary, 60% of young Americans today say they would sooner get the right to vote than to give up their access to TikTok. That's a disaster in terms of where we are right now. But I think I am the only candidate in this race who can actually reach and lead that next generation of Americans. And I do think we're in this middle of this identity crisis, that it's going to take a leader who answers what America is. I'm an America First conservative, but we have to rediscover what America is. And especially as a leader with fresh legs from the next generation, I can do that better than anybody else in this race, including Donald Trump.
A couple of follow-ups here. Some of the federal agencies and departments that you said you would get rid of entirely. Explain to folks that just a couple of them that you mentioned: CDC, yes. FBI, DOJ, Department of Education as well. What happens when they all go away? Who picks up for that kind of stuff? Their duties.
Sure. And so I mentioned FBI, ATF, CDC, U.S. Department of Education, for example. FBI, I'll give you that as the first one on the list. It's what I call the failed Bureau of Investigation. There's 35,000 employees at the FBI. 20,000 of them are in back office functions at the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., in the back office functions. They're going to go home and find honest work in the private sector. That's where a lot of the corruption comes from in the first place, is bureaucrats that effectively are making up the law instead of just enforcing the laws that are on the books. Now, 15,000 of them are investigative agents, cops on the front lines. We will move them to the U.S. Marshals or to the DEA, both of which have been far more effective at fighting child sex trafficking rings and the fentanyl epidemic than has been the FBI. We will move them to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network at the U.S. Treasury with far more specialization to go after financial fraudsters like the future SBFs or the FTXs of the world. And so that's at once how we will improve effectiveness, but while also standing for what's right, end the corruption. And I think that for the other Republicans, there are other Republicans in this race, good people, but who have a different view. Ron DeSantis will say, I'll fire Christopher Wray. Well, it sounds like a pleasant idea on paper, but the reality is you just get James Comey 2.0 afterwards. You have to be willing to gut the thing. There are other candidates who will say, let's build a new building for the FBI. I don't think we should be building any building for the FBI. I think we should be shutting down the one that already exists. And so that's where I go a little bit further than some of the other candidates as when it comes to actually the war on the permanent state, ending the administrative state. If there's one thing I think I'm better suited to do than anybody else who's been in American politics, it's to get in there and shut down that bureaucracy, and I will.
We're going to talk about a lot of different stuff, so I don't mean to be flippant. Listening to you right now, this literally might be the first time, and you've had 200, 300 events, whatever you had. I think this is literally the first time I've ever heard you that your voice sounds like you've talked a lot in this whole campaign.
I have, you know what? Thank you. You take notice of that. We have done so many events, but there was a couple of events the other day in the snowstorm. I'll tell you what happened, where they couldn't bring the microphone because we had ran with such a lean staff, and people still came out in droves to our events. So I really had to project without a microphone to large rooms, and that's where it finally got me, those couple of events in the last snowstorm. And I've been talking this way ever since.
All right, and I didn't mean to get us off track because we have a lot of questions, but that's the first time I've ever noticed that. Okay, Terry had a serious one about Donald Trump saying he violated his oath to protect the Constitution when he incited attack on the U.S. Capitol. He did not act in an expedient manner to protect it. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, I think that it's up to voters to judge the behaviors of their presidential candidates, but I disagree that there was anything illegal about Donald Trump's expression of opinions on January 6th. To be clear, he has not once been even charged with insurrection or incitement of insurrection, not once. And so I think these politicized persecutions through prosecution are wrong. And I think they set a dangerous precedent for this country. So much so that even yesterday, I just submitted personally a Supreme Court amicus brief in that Colorado instance to say that the Supreme Court needs to overturn Colorado's decision there on constitutional grounds, offering legal arguments that, frankly, I don't know if Trump's team is going to offer, but I offered because I think they're the right thing to do for this country. That being said, I'm in this race to lead our movement to the next level, and I don't think that I'm in this race to just bash somebody else or whatever else, Monday morning quarterback some decision somebody else made. I'm in this to lead our nation forward, to reunite this entire country. And yes, I think our country can be united around those America First principles. Donald Trump was an America First president. I'm going to be an America First president on steroids, but I think I can do that in a way that also revives our national character, revives unity in this country, and passes that on to the next generation. And so that's what I'm focused on rather than sitting here and blaming Donald Trump or anybody else who came before me. I actually on the campaign trail don't sit here bashing Joe Biden that much either, largely because what's the point? He is effectively a puppet. I don't even really see him as the president of the United States in any meaningful sense of the word. He's a puppet for the managerial class. And so something we're going to have to do is to actually bring back the presidency, have a U.S. president that reports to the people of this country rather than the permanent state and the bureaucrats there, which is what it's been for the last, frankly, as long as I can remember in American politics.
Okay, question from Patrick from Eldridge. If you're elected, what is your strategy for working with the legislative branch that Patrick considers entirely broken? So as president, how do you work with Congress?
So the first thing I will say is much of what I want to get done, much of what I've pledged to get done in the first year is actually in my capacity as the leader of the executive branch. 75% mass firing of federal bureaucrats. I get to do that as president. Moving our own troops to our own southern border, our military to our southern border and our northern border too. I get to do that as commander-in-chief. Don't just let our troops waste away in places like Germany where we've got 40,000 of them. Germany doesn't even spend 2% of its own national defense, of its GDP on national defense. They can defend their own borders. Those are decisions I get to make as the next U.S. president. Ending birthright citizenship for the kids of illegal migrants. I get to do that as the next U.S. president. Swear an oath to the Constitution and keep it. So there's a lot I'm going to do in those first couple of months that give us that early momentum to get some quick wins out of the gate. Rescind a lot of the unconstitutional federal regulations that Congress never actually passed. That's something we're going to be able to do in my capacity as U.S. president leading the executive branch of government. Now, that doesn't mean setting policy that goes through Congress. Laws should be passed through Congress. But rescinding prior executive actions or firing large numbers of bureaucrats, I get to do that as the next president, period. That then creates a tailwind of growing the economy, securing the border, putting the border crisis behind us. That then, I think, greases the wheels for a more productive relationship with Congress. And one of my signature legislative achievements, I hope in the first year, will be to ensure something that I don't think should be a Republican idea or a Democratic one. It's an American idea that we deserve elections we can trust and believe in. Single-day voting on Election Day as a national holiday with paper ballots, government-issued ID to match the voter file, and English as the sole language that appears on a ballot. I think that could actually be unifying for this country. And so that gives you a sense of at least how I'm going to lead.
You've already addressed some of this, but there's a follow-up here from Rebecca from West Branch. How are you going to deal with the national debt? If you've joined us from the beginning of this, and people are doing a scorecard, they can probably add up some of the things that you would you'd support to try to reduce federal spending. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. It's such an important question. I mean, young people now are growing up with about $200,000 of national debt on their shoulders that they didn't sign up for. That's not right. It's not right for them. It's not right for our country. And we owe it to the next generation, to our children and our grandchildren, to make sure that's not the circumstance that they grow up in. So I'll tell you what I'll do as the next president. I think that the key is how do you cut our national debt without actually cutting Social Security or Medicare or veterans benefits, which frankly many in the Republican Party seem to think that that's the way to go. I disagree. Here's how we'll address our national debt very pragmatically. Get the oil and natural gas out from underneath our ground and sell it. Use that to instantly buy down about $8 trillion of that national debt. Now, about $7 trillion of that national debt that we have, that $34 trillion number, is from two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that did not advance our national interests. 20 years later, the Taliban is still in charge, and Iraq is a more broken country than when we arrived. So what are we going to do there? Avoid repeating those same mistakes in the future in places like Ukraine. And I would negotiate a reasonable end to the Ukraine war so it doesn't become another money suck for the U.S. and increase the risk of World War III. And then the simplest thing to do is that 75% federal employee headcount reduction and shutting down many of those agencies. And the combination of those three things automatically gets our national debt well under control without touching Social Security, Medicare, or veterans benefits. And that's how I'm going to lead the country, with pride and with conviction. I think it's going to take a CEO, not just a politician. If a politician were going to do this, it would have happened already, and it hasn't. I think it's going to take a CEO to get this job done, and that's what I'm in this to accomplish.
What would this do to the economy and to the current government services if on one day 75% of these federal employees are gone?
I think in the medium term, it's actually going to be good for the economy because right now we have more job openings in the private sector than we do people even looking for work. the top obstacle for every small business in this country, nearly every small business in this country, is actually staffing their open positions if they actually want to grow. So I think that 2 for 1, you're eliminating the national debt, you're eliminating a lot of that federal corruption, eliminating a lot of that unconstitutional morass in Washington, D.C. by shutting down those agencies. And we're going to fire 75% of those federal employees. But you also have a tidal wave of Americans, not people from other countries, but people from this country who are able to then fill a lot of those open positions in our economy. So I think on balance, it's going to be a good thing for the economy, but it's going to be a great thing for our constitutional republic.
Okay, a question now from Michael in Davenport, so the other side of the state where you are right now. I don't know that I've heard you mention your stance on personal or business income taxes. How would you approach wrangling the IRS and the tax rate?
Well, the IRS is actually on my list of agencies to shut down, but part of the path to getting there will be implementing a simple vision of the tax code. Here's how I would do it. 12% flat tax across the board. Ordinary income, capital gain, business income, corporate taxation, all of it. 12% flat tax across the board. And then you could eliminate a lot of the cronyist deductions. And a dirty little secret is that the tax compliance costs in this country, so not the even taxes paid, just the tax compliance costs, the out-of-pocket costs to tax accountants, effectively to TurboTax, are $750 billion per year. That is staggering. That money belongs in the hands of everyday Americans. And yet, we have a special interest system that's all about lobbying for those special cronyist deductions. So I'm going to put an end to much of that, and I think that a 12% flat tax across the board is the way to go. And with that, we don't need an IRS with, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of agents. No, it should just be a simple revenue collection arm at the U.S. Treasury without any sort of judgment or political decision making. Every person's tax code should be able to fill out in one sheet of paper, 12% of what you made, that's it. Flat, no deductions, no anything else, that's it. And I think that's the way we're going to do this.
This concept's been around, as you know, with a flat tax, and folks who work in the nonprofit side of things who encourage donors to obviously donate, but to maybe get those charitable deductions. How would a flat tax impact them?
Well, look, the value of those deductions automatically go down. But more importantly, the tax rate itself goes down. So I think that we need to eliminate, I don't think the category of that exclusion, that shouldn't be what the tail that wags the dog. 12%, flatten it across the board. And the main thing that's going to allow me to actually accomplish this is we're going to downsize the federal government enough that that's all the government actually requires to pay for itself anyway. A lot of the deductions that bother me the most, not so much the charitable deductions, but a lot of the crony corporate deductions and special tax breaks as well as special tax incentives, that's what we need to focus on getting rid of the most, that add most complexity. But we want to downsize the federal government by 75%. I think we may be able to get the tax rate even lower than 12% eventually, but let's start with a flat 12% flat tax that grows this economy, and I think restores a sense of fairness in our tax code as well.
Okay, now a question geographically where we were originally going to meet you today in Sioux City, and it comes from JD, a little long, so bear with me for a sec. Nearly every part of our economy is concentrated, especially in agriculture, where just a few companies control the majority of the market share. Do you think competition is an important part of the American economy or do you think corporations have the right to act as monopolies?
No, I don't think the corporations have the right to act as monopolists, and I think competition is the absolute way forward. But what I really think is the greatest cancer on politics isn't just the monopoly kind of element of it. It's the fact that the biggest companies are the ones that actually get to lobby the government to keep smaller players out. That's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism. So what happens is the largest incumbents in any industry, take Big Pharma, lobby for all kinds of special provisions that help the incumbents but don't help competition. I've encountered this firsthand. I'm a businessman. For those of you who aren't familiar with my background, I'm not a politician. I'm a businessman. I've built multi-billion-dollar businesses from scratch. And my first and largest company was Roivant, which was a company that developed medicines that other pharmaceutical companies refused to develop. But one of the things I learned through that process is part of the reason why the threshold for getting a new FDA-approved drug is so high is actually that Big Pharma wants it that way. Now, that's counterintuitive. Why would Big Pharma want to have even greater barriers to bring its own medicines to market? It's because once they bring it to market, they can actually exert much more monopoly pricing leverage if nobody else as a competitor has actually entered that same market. So that's one of the areas where I've seen it firsthand. You see the same thing in the ag sector. You see the same thing in big food. You see the same thing in big tech. And so we need to end the lobbying. That's what I say. If you've worked in the government, you should not lobby that same government for at least 10 years until you leave that government. Individual congressmen shouldn't be allowed to trade individual stocks. You shouldn't be joining the board of a company after you've been in Congress or regulating that same company as a bureaucrat. I don't think that's too much to ask, and I don't think that there's a good reason why that better serves the interests of the American people. Now, as it relates to large agricultural companies, I also want to just say something about what's going on here in Iowa. The CO2 pipeline that's being built across over half of this state. I think it is pathetic. I think it is wrong that CO2 pipeline is being built by companies that receive subsidies from the federal government, our taxpayer dollars, going to some companies to capture carbon dioxide out of ethanol plants, and then to bury that in the ground, underneath the ground, all the way across this state into South Dakota, then North Dakota. For what end? The climate change agenda is based on false premises. I don't believe it has any net benefit to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from air. And yet, that's exactly what we are paying for. Why? Because large companies are able to lobby for it. And yes, we have to put an end to that. I think the lobbying and the super PAC industrial complex, the super PACs are a cancer on American politics today. And that's what I believe.
Just a clarification, the pipeline that they're looking at here, and I think there are two left. I don't know that they get subsidies yet, though, right? Don't they have? They're not approved yet.
They do.
Right? What are they
well,
already
they
getting?
would. I mean, that's the whole point. Well, that's what they would get, though, for every metric ton of CO2 that's captured.
Yeah.
It would get it, and these wouldn't be built without those federal subsidies.
For sure.
That's the point.
Okay.
And the same thing with electric vehicle subsidies, I would say, and the electric vehicle subsidies as well. And that's part of the crony capitalism where you see it is with this climate change agenda that absolutely is a hoax because it has nothing to do with the climate. And I think it is telling that I'm the only presidential candidate here in Iowa who can actually take a clear position against the use of eminent domain and against the use of the subsidies for that CO2 pipeline. The only candidate who can tell you that that climate change agenda is indeed a hoax because it has nothing to do with the climate. And I think if you want somebody who's going to get in there and actually gut the deep state and actually speak truth to power, then vote for somebody who's going to speak the truth to you. And in this race, that's me.
Okay, a few questions about Social Security, and they're pretty similar, so I'm gonna smash two of them together here. Karen and this other one from Sioux City. Essentially, it's the solvency of Social Security, and Karen had asked, is it even sustainable? And if so, what would you suggest to sustain it for the future?
So there's a key suggestion here. I think this is our last window to be able to reduce our national debt burden and solve that problem without cutting Social Security or Medicare. I think that changes. In about 5 years, the interest payments on our national debt become the largest line item in our federal budget, which means we can't borrow anymore, which means we're in quicksand. And I think Social Security then becomes a major problem because you can't borrow to fill the trust fund anymore either. Here's the solution. 40 years ago, if the Social Security Trust Fund had been even allowed to be invested in the same way your financial advisor would tell you to invest your 401k account, in some stocks, some bonds, some treasuries, a diversified portfolio, the average person collecting $1,800 per month today would actually be collecting close to $18,000 per month right now. That is staggering. That is government malpractice of the highest order. Imagine, without adding a dime to our national debt, if you were able to just be collecting an $18,000 per month check in your mailbox, that would be life-changing to many people, most Americans on Social Security. Well, we can't change the past, but we can change the future. So I gave earlier my plan to shave down the national debt by bringing oil and gas out of the ground and selling it and cutting 75% of federal bureaucrats and avoiding pointless foreign wars. Well, against that backdrop, I think I can not only fight that national debt without cutting Social Security, I think we can ask the question for the next generation to say, how might we actually even increase Social Security benefits. In fact, so for so many seniors, the reality is those Social Security benefits have been inflated away in their value. They haven't kept up, and many seniors are having a lot of difficulty even making ends meet, and that's wrong. So one of the things I've said is that, what we're going to get is we're actually going to address the national debt crisis, but do it while also not just not making Social Security cuts, but actually asking the question more ambitiously, how might we even be able to increase Social Security benefits? And the idea of allowing it to be invested as a diversified portfolio is a big part of getting there.
And if you're just tuning into this conversation with Vivek Ramaswamy, if you look over his right shoulder here, you can see that he's on the move, and you can also see the weather conditions on the outside, which is why we're improvising as we work our way through here. Shirley had a question about a topic that you already touched on a bit, and it involves securing the southern border. Could you drill down a little bit? You talked about shifting military to the southern border. Can you drill down on that a little bit in the sense, are you talking about bringing our military members from other countries to then put on the southern border, or how does that work out?
Sure. Yeah. So let me just explain my border policies comprehensively, because I think they're important, and I think that this will solve the problem in a relatively short amount of time at that, after I take office. So the first thing we need to do is to make sure that our own taxpayer money does not go to Central America or Mexico, and instead require every one of those countries to build a border wall on their own borders, all the way from Venezuela to the southern border of Texas. Keep in mind, about 80% of the people crossing from the southern border with Mexico didn't start in Mexico. They started south of Mexico. So those countries each need to build their own border barricades all the way up from Venezuela to the southern border of Texas. Next is, yes, I will complete the creation of the wall, but I will also go further and use our own troops, yes, on our own southern border. You can actually get a lot of those troops, if you do the math of places where they're stationed where they shouldn't be. I think we have too many troops in Germany, for example, stationing them across our own southern border. And from other places where they've been in training or otherwise in the United States, you can actually do a lot of training while they're stationed down there. That's how I would have enough troops on the southern border. It's not like what you think. It's not like people are crossing over and the government's trying to tackle them and chase them down. That's not it. Right now, it's a very orderly process to bring these people in. So moving our troops to the southern border also sends a powerful signal, which says we're no longer open for business for just mass illegal migration into our country. Now, with that said, let's pursue the best border policies of all, which is to end the incentives to be here illegally. And that's why I've said I would end birthright citizenship for the kids of illegals. It does not apply to them. And I would also make sure anybody who's in this country illegally is returned to their country of origin, and that we stop using our federal taxpayer dollars to effectively pay for these sanctuary cities that are funding the breakage of the rule of law. So hopefully that gives you a sense for how I would comprehensively address our border crisis. And right now, I would tell you this is, we'll have that done by March of 2025, and the mass deportations would be well underway by December of 2025. This is achievable. The country that put a man in the moon can do this. The question is, do we have the spine and the political fortitude and the will? And if I'm in the White House, we do. And I think that's why I'm asking for your vote, is we can very pragmatically revive those ideals that the country was founded on, but do it in a way that doesn't have to be, I don't think there's anything that I said to you that is particularly divisive or partisan in nature. It shouldn't be. And so that's how I'm going to lead the country.
For the deportation, and a few others have talked about this as well, this would be federal resources then to send all these folks back to their home country, and how does that work? Is it when they're
Yes, well, it would be.
Go ahead.
It's a great question. So it'd be a lot fewer federal resources than the federal resources we're using for federal funding of sanctuary cities. I mean, mass migration to Chicago, you have the inner city of Chicago where South Shore High School is being converted into an encampment for migrants. And it's about, the cost of doing that is about $7,000 per migrant per month. That's actually a lot less than the total cost to do a one-time deportation of any one of those people. So those federal resources are the resources that are being used to fuel this mass migration crisis. Anyway, I'm going to put an end to it. And the other thing I would say is, well, if you use those federal resources, you actually have a net saving One of the reasons they've said it's hard to use ICE to be able to lead the way in those mass deportations is there's only 6,000 ICE agents, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents. But there are millions who are already here. This is where we got to use the law, a president's own understanding of the law. There's a section of the law, I think it's 287G, which effectively says that the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol and the U.S. ICE can actually delegate their law enforcement power, including the power to serve their warrants, to local law enforcement. Now you have over 1 million local law enforcement able, standing by and ready to do it. And that's part of their job anyway, because one of the waves of violent crime in this country is coming from people who came over via that southern border. So it's within the remit of local law enforcement to do it. But the absence of funding isn't the problem. It's the absence of political will. That's actually what's stopping us. And I'm going to bring a spine of steel to that White House. That's what it's going to take to get the job done, and we will.
Ann from Worthington has a question about why are we giving billions of dollars in aid to countries that are decimated, in her opinion. And this might be maybe this is the entry point for you to explain. What would your philosophy be when it comes, as you're looking to make big cuts in federal spending? How do you look at the amount of money the country divvies out in foreign aid?
Yeah, so look, I think most foreign aid should end. That's a flat answer to your question. I don't even think we should be funding multilateral institutions that are hostile to our own sovereignty, like the WHO or the UN either. Now, my view is we're $34 trillion in the hole, and most of our foreign aid goes to countries whose national debt per person is actually less than ours here in the United States. That's staggering. So somebody else has less of a debt problem than us, but we're racking up more national debt to send them money. That will end on my watch. And I do not think that the U.S. has done a good job of this. I think that, frankly, both parties are responsible for this failure. But foreign aid, of 99% of it, certainly will end on my watch. And the aid that we do provide will ask the question of how does this advance American interests? That's what this is going to take.
We've still got a bunch of questions. I'm going to keep plowing forward unless your voice is about ahead of you.
Sure.
Still good?
We're good. I think we're good till, what did we say, almost the bottom of the hour, right?
Yeah, almost the top of the hour. Yeah, we've already blown past the bottom. So you holler when you're getting your next stop here.
We'll be good. We'll be good to go to the top of the hour.
Okay, sounds good.
Close to it.
All right, we're moving on the fly here. All right, question from Rodney.
Thank you.
Do you feel that foreign countries should be allowed to purchase American land, farmland, or otherwise? As you know, there have been about 36 states that have restricted certain countries. China is kind of the primary target. It's been banned from foreign ownership in Iowa for quite some time. Generally, as you're looking at this from a federal standpoint, do you have issues with foreign countries owning any American land?
CCP affiliated entities should not be allowed to buy land in the United States of America. That's a national security issue. That's not a economic point I'm making. It's a national security point. We don't want our kids to be a bunch of Chinese serfs 30, 40, 50 years from now. That's where we're headed. And so I think it's important that we don't have foreign ownership of land in this country. There's about 60 Chinese transformers in our own electric grid right now. We have to harden that electric grid because otherwise it's vulnerable to a cyber attack or a super EMP attack, an electromagnetic pulse attack, that I think could be very dangerous for this country. And so that's what I stand for. Specifically, the focus is on China. I think if you start going to foreign ownership of land, then okay, some guy who, grew up in Montreal and lives there, or in Toronto has, owns some land in upstate Michigan. I think we ought to be very laser focused and precise about how we're going to actually change the way things are done for the better. I'd say start with ban the CCP from buying any land in this country. That's what I'll require of Xi Jinping, frankly. When I sit across the table from him, I'm going to say, you won't buy land in this country. You won't donate to universities in this country. You won't turn our companies into lobbying pawns to advance your own agenda. And that's how I'm going to lead with a spine. I don't think that we should be depending on our enemy to buy our land, or depending on our enemy for our pharmaceuticals, depending on our enemy for our military equipment, or our electronics, or the shoes on our feet, or the phones in our pockets, to power our modern way of life, because that empowers China to eventually really have a lot of economic and even geopolitical leverage over the United States. And I refuse to see that happen on my watch.
Some scenic trees you just passed, by the way. You're missing a great view, so
I was
sorry
just
about
noting.
that.
It's quite beautiful here. It seems like almost like you're like in a skiing location or something like that in a winter wonderland. You know, it's a beauty. And I'll say that we didn't cancel our events today. We went to the Northwest, and this is our third event of the day. We're gonna be making every effort to make it to our fourth as well, which I expect we will. We're definitely making our third one here in Council Bluffs in Potawatomi County. That's what this process is all about, showing up. And if the Iowans here are showing up to see us, I'm going to show up to see them. By the end of this process, we're now approaching over 390 events. That's more than all of the other campaigns combined. And this has been what's Apoorv and I are so grateful for, is the friends we've made through this process. Seeing people who do the hard work of vetting their candidates. Frankly, many of you who are taking the time on a Friday afternoon to come to this live stream, ask me questions. The same kind of spirit of people who would come to a pizza ranch or to a diner to ask me questions well thought out. Even young people from the next generation who we've often written off. No, I think that many of them are coming out for a reason. And so I'm grateful for this process. And I understand now, in a way that I probably didn't fully appreciate, certainly at the time that this race started. I appreciate it now for why Iowa goes first. Frankly, whatever happens on Monday, I'm going to miss the time we spent here. It's really going to be something in our family's heart that we miss for a long time to come, because we took a lot away from this as a year, in our year as a family here together. I'm so grateful for what the people of the state have given us in terms of hope and inspiration at so many steps of the way, knowledge of the questions about the risks that we face, pushing me to be the best version of myself. And that's the kind of president I want to be for this country as well. But I'm so grateful to the people of this state. It means a lot. It's been not only the experience of a lifetime, but the send-off, hopefully to the White House, to lead this country with a sense of inspiration and hope for the people who care about this country, the patriots who care about this country. And I just wanted to take this as an occasion to say, yes, we are brave in the cold and the weather today, but you know what? George Washington did that when he crossed the Delaware. And we live in a 1776 moment right now where it is going to require leaders to step up and stand with the spine, with conviction, to do the right thing. And that's what I'm doing right now.
And Washington didn't have a four-wheel drive SUV too, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Exactly.
All right, a lot more.
Exactly.
I'll try to.
That's we believe in showing up. Exactly.
Okay, I'll try to push forward here quickly. Camden had this one. What's your thought on the military draft, and should it include both men and women?
Yeah, so I'm basically, right now the selective service registration includes only men, not women. I think that doesn't make any sense, but let's take a step back. I don't think that mandatory service is the way to go in the United States. And I explored this idea in my first book, Woke Inc. I actually was sort of more drawn to it then. That was the first of my 3 books. And as I often tell people, I agree with about 95% of what's in the first one. My thoughts have evolved a little bit. I don't think that mandatory service is the way to go in the United States. But what I do think we need is a revival of civic duty in this country. So one of the positions I've adopted, because I do think that's part of what we're missing in this country, is the revival of civic duty, the revival of citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen? What obligations do we owe to our country? And I think one of those basic obligations is to know something about the country at the very least. So I've said that every high school senior should have to pass the same civics test in order to become a full voting citizen of this country. That is what I believe. And if not, through at least passing that same civics test that the immigrants pass, then 6 months of military service or service in a first responder role. That's what I believe it's going to take. And so I'm in this for a reason. I believe that not only do we need to grow our economy and secure our border, we need to revive a better job of standing for our veterans. We don't do that in this country. And I think a country that doesn't for its veterans.
This is the first time we've had a glitch despite you being on the road. Let's give it a second, see if this reconnects. Bear with us a sec, folks, as we'll see if this signal reconnects as he's on the move here. We've done pretty well for the first 43 minutes, somehow defying defying the odds here as the signal remained pretty strong. Let's see if it'll connect on its own. Okay, I'm gonna stall for about 30 more seconds, folks. If you can hang with us, just to see if this reconnects on its own, or we may have to wish him well.
I think we're back. Can you hear me?
Hey, we can hear you. You're getting back. Thanks for sticking through this. All right, hey,
Good.
And
yeah, thank you.
Of all
thank you for
things,
your patience as well.
Of all things, we are not going to allow that big old glitch when you're talking about veterans because it's too important a topic.
Yeah.
For the most part, most of what you were saying about veterans was pretty tough to understand, frankly. So if you don't mind rewinding a bit there, just to kind of
Say it
sum
again.
up. So if you don't mind summing up that, yeah, thanks.
I think a nation that does not stand for its veterans is not really a nation. And so I've offered comprehensive veterans policies of how we can actually stand for the people who have served this country. I think that if you have served abroad, you should not be thrust back into civilian life without a decompression buffer, 6-week paid decompression buffers, more privacy restrictions for veterans to report their PTSD, frankly. Many of them aren't doing it for fear of being tagged with a red flag law. I think that veterans shouldn't have to drive 250 miles or 120 miles to the nearest VA to be able to get their medical care. They should be able to get local community-based medical care paid for through the VA. There are basic changes to make. Medical choice for veterans, including access to on a medical basis. I think that these are great ways we can make sure we're not a country where 40 veterans a day, upwards of that, are committing suicide. And I've said that all veterans benefits and active duty military compensation should no longer be subject to federal taxation. And part of the reason why we have a 25% recruitment deficit in our military, don't want
Yeah, we're going to do the same thing we did before. Let's pause for just a moment and see if this will fix itself on the fly. This is the joy and the challenge of doing these live events on the move as we try to go through plans B, C, and D to make sure that we can still get this live conversation out to everybody as we deal with a lot of weather challenges across our state. So let's give his vehicle a moment and see if it'll reconnect.
We're almost done. Can you stop in this?
Okay, hey,
Space?
hey,
Can you hear me?
yeah, we've got your stream back.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, good. We're gonna try to.
I think he's working his way to find a place to stop and park. So we'll stall just a bit as we wait here. We're coming up on the top of the hour, which he then has to go for his next event. We can hear you again, so we're making progress. Thanks for
Good.
trudging through here, and we've
Good.
got your face again, so that's a good combination.
Thank you, and I appreciate your guys' patience.
One bad little stretch.
Help address the recruitment deficit.
Yeah.
Yes, and now, okay. Now you guys are any better or no?
Yeah, but you just keep re-emerging. You've re-emerged again.
Well, I'll keep going, and once we get to a place, I'll actually be able to go a little long with you guys. We can go a little bit over the top of the hour.
Appreciate everybody hanging in here. We'll see as he's moving his way toward Council Bluffs for another event. We'll see if that makes this a little better. We've been fortunate that we've gone almost 50 minutes so far as he's traversed across the western part of Iowa on the road so that we can try to make this conversation happen. So appreciate everybody who submitted questions so far and for your patience as we've now over the last 2 minutes kind of hit this little glitch as it's sometimes tough to connect all the phone signals out there while somebody's en route. So we'll hang on for another sec here, and if we can't reestablish, then we may have to bid him well.
Kevin, we're in a good spot. We're in a decent spot now. Hello.
Hey.
I can hear you now.
Hey, thanks for plugging away. So this is
all right.
This is your test.
We found
here,
a good
right?
spot here.
Awesome.
Yeah. We found a good spot here. Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah.
Absolutely. Hold on 1 second.
Stream is still live, and your audio and video look good here.
Can we just like? No. We can't. We got to keep moving. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully we're in a good spot. So let's continue.
Hey, we'll
to keep
plugging.
going for a little bit.
Right, being president's hard, right? So this is it's all about overcoming challenges. So here's a live test for you in front of thousands of people.
Absolutely, and you know, when Washington didn't complain about the weather when he crossed the Delaware either. So I'll tell you that.
All right. So, hey, we'll try to end it. I know we're getting up on the top of the hour here, so I'm going to try to fire off a couple more questions, and we'll see if technology works with us here. Harold's got one about, would you be in favor of limiting the number of executive orders any president can use? This is something that maybe starting with George W. Bush has kind of picked up in frequency.
Yeah, so I actually absolutely favor limiting the executive order. To the contrary, I think one of the things that we need to do is rescind a lot of those old unconstitutional executive orders that have been issued in the past. The reality is these executive orders are unconstitutional, not just the ones that came from the president, but even the regulations from the administrative state. A lot of the regulations from those three-letter agencies, the truth is Congress never gave those agencies the power to issue those regulations. So the way I'm going to do this is, as the next president, we're going to shut down many of those agencies. We're going to actually not only fire the federal bureaucrats, but most of those federal regulations are, in my view, unconstitutional today. And the most important Supreme Court case of our lifetime came out last year. It was West Virginia versus EPA, which held that many of those EPA regulations are actually unconstitutional because Congress never authorized them. So I'm going to rescind a lot of the old executive orders, of course. Executive Order 11246, that's one from Lyndon Johnson. I'm going to rescind on day one. It requires anybody in the private sector who does business with the government or gets funds from the government to adopt these toxic racial and gender quota systems. Well, I'm going to put an end to that. That was unconstitutional, and it's also bad policy. But I'm also going to end all of those effective executive orders that come from the administrative state, the three-letter agencies, as so-called rules that Congress never actually authorized. And if there's one thing I get done as your next president, it will be to actually shut down that deep state. That's something that it takes an outsider, somebody with the muscle, if you will, as an entrepreneur and a businessman, and I bring that, and Trump brought some of that. I bring that on steroids. But it's also going to take somebody who knows and deeply understands the law and the Constitution in this country. And those two things don't usually go together, actually. You have the business guy over here, you've got the legal scholar over there. In my case, that's what gives me my sense of purpose and duty to be in this race and to lead this country. I believe God gives each of us our own unique God-given gifts. And it's our duty, it's our moral duty to use those gifts to do what is right in the short time that we're given. And yes, that's why I'm in this race. That's what I believe it's my duty to my country to make sure when we have a president right now, who do we need? Somebody who can shut down that federal bureaucracy, that permanent state, that deep state, the shadow government that's actually making the rules today. That's what I'm going to be able to do as the next U.S. president, undo a lot of the damage that's been done by the executive branch in the past. And I get to undo that damage without actually going through Congress because the damage itself was done by the executive branch. We can rescind a lot of those unconstitutional executive orders as the next president as well, and I will.
A question from Leah. Why hasn't medical cannabis been legalized on a federal level?
Well, look, I think that there's a lot of state-level patchwork that's been happening in this country. At the federal level, you've got the federal government. That everything has to go through Congress. That's a separate matter. But one thing that I have stood for, this goes back to my veterans policy, and I know we were glitching a little bit, so I maybe just put a fine point on that. I believe so many veterans who are suffering from PTSD today are turning to suicide or fentanyl or worse. Well, what I believe is that Schedule 1 drugs should be descheduled for veterans with PTSD to be able to get that through as medical care through the VA. Far better than fentanyl or suicide or other places they're turning. And so that's something that I will be able to do as the next president of the United States. And that's where my focus is in at least bringing some sensibility into the way that we're applying the federal drug scheduling. Veterans with PTSD do deserve greater access to medical choice through the VA system. And that's what I stand for.
Speaking of drugs, a question about pharmaceuticals from Larry. How would you handle the disparity in pharmaceutical prices that we pay as Americans versus what citizens in other countries pay? Is there anything you can do about that as president?
Yes, there is. There's two things. One is we need more competition here in the United States. Part of the reason insulin costs so much in the United States, but less so in other countries, is that other countries have more competitive options, but the United States doesn't. And I know a lot about this, in part because my first company was a biotech company that challenged the way that big pharma actually developed those medicines. I developed a number of medicines that pharma declined to develop. 5 of them are FDA-approved products today. One of them is a life-saving therapy in kids, and that's probably one of the things I'm most proud of in my career. There are kids alive today because of some of those medicines we developed. But I can tell you from experience, we could have developed those drugs at a tiny fraction of the cost without trading off really any value or any certainty about safety or anything else if the FDA regulations hadn't been set where they are. And pharma's the one that lobbies for them to be set where they are. Why? Because it reduces competition, which allows them to exert maximum pricing leverage. That's wrong. The other way that we have to address this, though, is other countries do pay less for another reason. Like Germany, they're free riding on the United States. They know that if a pharmaceutical company brings a drug to market, they're doing it with the U.S. market as the main intention. But given that you've already brought that drug to market in the U.S., then it only makes sense for the pharmaceutical company to sell it in Germany because they don't have to go through the whole process again, because Germany can use the U.S. process to say it's safe and effective, but they don't pay for nearly as much. So one thing we should do is to say that if a U.S. company goes through that process here in the United States, that's a burdensome process nonetheless. First is we need to make it less burdensome. But the second thing is we should say that they can't sell that drug in the other country unless that other country is paying the same price that we are. So I know that was a little complicated, but I know how to do this. And by the time I'm out of office in my first year, by the end of my first term even, if we don't have greater parity in drug prices between the U.S. and other countries, then I will not have done my job. And I do think that it's fair for me to say that's a standard you should hold us to. And I think we're going to get that job done. The reality is we don't even have a healthcare system in the United States today. It's one of the questions that I think I've learned the most from our time in Iowa, that it's one of the issues you don't hear from other candidates on. The national press hasn't focused on it as much, but it matters a lot to people, is how much their healthcare costs today. And the reality is we don't have a healthcare system. We have a sick care system. We have a system that pays for the elimination of sickness, but not much to actually pay for the things that leave us healthy. My wife, Apurva, and I believe she's going to be a hero of a first lady when she's in the White House. She's a throat surgeon. She cares for cancer survivors at the Ohio State Cancer Hospital, many of whom have not swallowed food for years after they've gone through cancer care recovering from their cancer. She works on a kind of procedure that allows those patients to swallow food. But the broken healthcare system that we have, they'll pay for all kinds of expensive pill-pushing behaviors. They'll pay for feeding tubes or other expensive interventions, but in many cases doesn't pay for the set of procedures that actually helps those patients. In Apurva's case, in my wife's case, in many cases she does those procedures without even herself personally getting paid for it. And you know what? That thankfully works for our family because this country has blessed us with an American dream that my parents would have never imagined possible when they came to this country 40 years ago with no money, that I would have never imagined when I was growing up in Evendale, Ohio, when my dad was facing down layoffs at the GE plant there. And so thankfully for our family, that works, but it doesn't work system-wide. And so we need more competitive private health insurance as well. Right now, the reason health insurance costs are high and health insurance doesn't cover many forms of actual health, as opposed to just paying for sickness, is because of lobbying. They've lobbied for a system that they're exempt from antitrust exemptions, while at the same time, that allows them to actually limit the scope of competition. So yes, I'm going to bring competition both to pharma and as well as to the health insurance marketplace. And that's how we get this back. And I've really enjoyed this conversation so much, but I probably have time for one final question before we wrap it up.
I think our stream ends here right at 4 o'clock, so we'll have to end it there. But hey, thanks to you and your team for working.
Well, if I just say
through
one
this.
last thing, try
to do it in 10 seconds because we're going to lose this stream. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, the thing I'm going to say is, if you want to vote for America first and take it to the next level, and even to save Trump in this country, a vote for me is actually the way to do it. And that's why I'm asking for your help on Monday night and your vote at the Iowa caucus. And if you do your part, my family and I, we're going to do ours to make sure our best days are still ahead of us.
All right. We appreciate the time. Be safe.
Thank you. I appreciate that, guys. Thanks for taking the time and thanks for your patience.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.